Caleb Asante was 43 years old, a structural engineer who had spent his career making sure buildings stood up long after the people who paid for them had forgotten his name. He drove a truck that was 9 years old and ran clean because he serviced it himself. He wore the same field boots he'd worn for 5 years, resoled twice, because they still had work left in them. That winter, his wife told him she needed space to think, and he moved into a hotel without an argument, leaving her the penthouse on the 41st floor of a tower downtown. 6 weeks later, a doorman he trusted called to tell him another man had moved his things into the unit. The man's name was Roland. Roland had told the building staff he'd be staying indefinitely. He had no idea who actually owned the floor he was sleeping on. He had no idea how wrong he was about the man whose place he'd taken. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The site was still dark when Caleb pulled in. No sunrise yet, just the gray light off the river and the cold coming up through the gravel. He filled his thermos in the truck and screwed the lid tight. He had a tower going up 2 blocks from the one he lived in, 44 floors of his own drawings becoming steel, and he liked to walk the deck before the crews arrived, when the building was just bones and possibility. He stood at the edge of the 41st floor of the new one and looked across at the old one, at the lit window of the penthouse where a man he'd never invited was making coffee in his kitchen. He did not feel what people expected a man to feel in that moment. He felt the specific, certain quiet of someone who already knew how a load was going to settle. Caleb had spent 18 years building a name in a trade where the name was the only thing that outlasted the concrete. Developers requested him by reputation. When a project's numbers didn't close, his was the firm that found the way to make the structure work without cutting the bones. He had designed the tower on Halsted, with the penthouse Renata loved. Designed it. Then, taken an ownership stake in the development when the original partner pulled out, because Caleb understood that the man who builds the thing should own a piece of the thing. He had never told Renata the size of that stake. He had never told her he held title to the entire residential floor she lived on, the penthouse, and the 2 units beside it, through a holding company that bore none of their names. It hadn't been a secret so much as a thing she never asked about, because she had decided early what Caleb was, and a man who wore resold boots was not, in her accounting, a man who owned buildings. He had let her believe it. He didn't know it then, but she had been planning her exit for over a year. She had just been waiting until she was sure she'd land somewhere softer. The morning the doorman called, Caleb was on the deck of the new tower with a set of plans rolled under his arm. Marcus had worked the front desk of the Halsted building for 9 years, and Caleb had written him a reference once and gotten his son a summer apprenticeship, and Marcus did not forget that kind of thing. "I didn't want to tell you over the phone," Marcus said. His voice was measured even, "but you'd want to know. There's a gentleman moved into 41A. Mrs. Asante had us let him up. He's got the staff calling him by name now. He told the concierge he's the man of the house." Caleb set the plans down on the deck rail. He didn't drop them. He laid them flat, the way he set down anything he intended to pick up again. "What's the name?" Caleb said. It wasn't a question. He already had the shape of the answer. "Roland. Roland Vane. He runs some kind of investment thing. He's been having packages sent up. Furniture, this week." Marcus paused. "He asked me yesterday if the building had a residence parking spot he could claim. Said he'd be staying permanently." Caleb thanked him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask Marcus to do anything. He noticed, the way he noticed a hairline crack in a pore. 2 things he did not react to. The first was that Renata had moved a man into a residence she did not own, in a building whose ownership she had never once been curious about. The second was that Roland Vane ran some kind of investment thing, and that a man with real money does not move into a woman's apartment and have furniture delivered to it. He filed both away. He didn't decide yet what they meant. What Caleb had built over the 6 years of the marriage was not the penthouse. He understood that now. What he had built was a habit of giving Renata the version of himself she found least embarrassing. The quiet one. The one who didn't talk about the work. The one who let her tell people he was in construction because the truth bored her. He had wired her into the best life he could engineer and asked for almost nothing back. And she had taken the asking for nothing as proof there was nothing there. 3 years earlier, when her event planning company nearly folded, he had moved $60,000 into the business account over 4 months without telling her, so she wouldn't feel the floor go soft under her. She had announced to her friends that she'd turned it around herself. He had let her have that, too. He had a long history of letting her have things. His Aunt Adelaide had watched all of it. She was 69, small, with silver hair she kept short and reading glasses on a beaded chain. She had never said a word against Renata, because Adelaide was the kind of woman who waited to be asked. She lived in a tidy unit on the 9th floor of the Halsted building. Caleb had put her there, in one of the apartments his holding company owned, the year his uncle passed. Her place smelled of coffee and cedar, and something sweet always going cool on the counter. She was the one person in Caleb's world who said his name like it had weight to it. That was what Renata had never understood. Until the winter everything turned, Adelaide had been the only person counting on his side. He went to see her that evening. He sat at her table and ate, because she made him. And the quiet of her kitchen did what the silence of the penthouse never had. She watched him over the glasses. She knew the look of a man absorbing a load. "You'll want to call Walter," she said, after a while. Walter was the attorney who had handled the holding company's filings for 15 years. "It's a separation," Caleb said. She wanted space. I gave it to her. Adelaide folded her hands. "Eat first," she said. "Then listen." She told him what she had been watching from 9 floors below. Roland Vane had been coming to the building since the spring, long before the word space had ever crossed Renata's mouth. Adelaide had a habit of sitting in the lobby with her crossword in the late afternoon, and she had a memory for faces and a notebook for things that didn't fit. Black cover, spiral bound. She set it on the table and opened it. The first entry was dated in April. Neat handwriting. Date. Time. The man's description. The car at the curb. Below it, a photograph she'd taken on her phone through the lobby glass, Roland Vane, and Renata's hand on his arm. In the month Renata had told Caleb she felt closer to him than ever. "There's more," Adelaide said. "But it can wait until you've talked to Walter." He called Walter at 7 the next morning. Walter's voice was even, unhurried, the voice of a man who'd delivered weight before. Caleb asked him to pull the current standing on the Halsted residential floor. Title, encumbrances, the lease and occupancy terms on 41A. Walter already knew the answer. He drafted it. The penthouse and the 2 adjacent units were held outright by the holding company, no mortgage, clean title. Renata had never been an owner. She had never even been a tenant of record. She had a license to occupy, granted informally by Caleb, revocable by the company at any time. Roland Vane had moved into a residence that did not belong to the woman who let him in a building owned by the man he'd replaced. "There's something else you should see," Walter said. Vane's firm. "You'll want to be sitting down for the irony. It turned out Roland Vane ran a small fund that raised money for development projects, and one of the projects in his current portfolio, the one he'd been using to impress investors all year, was a stake he claimed to hold in the Halsted Tower. He had been telling people he was an owner in the very building he was now squatting in. He had sold limited partners on a position he did not have, in a property held by a holding company whose principal he had never met, whose name he had never bothered to learn, because he was sleeping in the man's penthouse and assumed the man was gone. There was one more layer, and Walter found it the way he found everything, by reading the parts other people skimmed. While Renata had been telling Caleb she needed space, she had been moving money. Not large amounts at first, a few thousand here, drawn off the household account she still had access to. Then larger, until the total reached just over $55,000 across the spring and summer. The destination was a single account, opened in April, the same month the photographs began. It belonged to a limited partnership. The general partner of that partnership was Roland Vane's fund. She had been quietly seeding the man's investment vehicle with her husband's money, betting Caleb's earnings on Roland's story the same way Roland was betting strangers' money on a building he didn't own. Walter traced the transfers, the dates, the account, and he preserved all of it, the way you preserve a thing, rather than set it off. Caleb read the transfer record once. Then he folded it in half and in half again and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He thought about the winter Renata's company had nearly failed, and the $60,000 he'd moved into her account without telling her, and how she'd told her friends she'd turned it around herself. She had learned the trick of moving money quietly from the only person who'd ever done it quietly for her. She had just pointed it the other direction. Caleb spread it all on Adelaide's table. The notebook. The photographs dated back to April. The occupancy license that made Roland a guest of a guest. The transfer record tracing $55,000 of his own household money into Vane's partnership. The fund prospectus Walter had pulled, with the Halsted position listed as an asset. He stood over the whole of it the way he stood over a set of plans, not reading any one sheet, reading all of them together, feeling where the lines connected. Renata had not left him for a wealthier man. She had left him for a man who was selling other people a stake in Caleb's own building. The lover had moved into the penthouse because he thought it confirmed the lie he'd been telling investors. He had no idea the floor under him was the evidence against him. He could see the whole shape of it now. He didn't move fast. That was the part neither of them would ever be able to account for. Renata had spent 6 years deciding what kind of man Caleb was, and she had been wrong about the one thing that mattered. She had mistaken his patience for the absence of capability. It wasn't. Patience was the most practiced skill he had. It was simply the one she had never had a reason to watch him use. If he'd wanted fast, the company could have revoked the occupancy license and put a notice on the door before Roland finished unpacking. One letter, done. But a notice on a door was an argument, and arguments could be dismissed. He wanted a proceeding. Proceedings could not. He let the separation run exactly as Renata had framed it. He had Walter prepare the dissolution on her terms, agreeing to the division she'd asked for, the joint account, the cars, the furniture she thought was hers. He understood the sequencing. You don't pull wire before the conduit is run. He let her believe she was walking away clean and ahead. Quietly, he had Walter notify Roland Vane's limited partners, through proper channels, that the holding company had no record of any Vane position in the Halsted property and would be issuing a formal disclosure. He had the company prepare a revocation of the 41A occupancy license, dated lawful, citing an unauthorized occupant. He did not serve it yet. He set the date for the morning after the dissolution closed, when Renata's claim to the residence would be permanently and demonstrably nothing. "She thinks this is already over," Caleb said. Adelaide said nothing. She refilled his coffee. He called Renata near the end. His voice was even, cooperative. He said he wanted to handle the unit transition without it getting ugly, that he'd come by the building to sort out the keys and the last of his things. She agreed before he finished the sentence. He could hear the relief she was trying to keep out of her voice and mostly failing. She thought he was coming to hand over what was left. He set the phone face down on Adelaide's table. Caleb arrived at the building 40 minutes early. On any site, the engineer who arrived last was already behind. He didn't go up. He'd asked Walter to set the meeting in the building's ground floor management office. Long table, neutral walls, the lobby's morning light coming flat through the glass, the city moving gray and enormous outside. Walter arrived at 9:40 with a forensic accountant named Okonkwo, who laid 3 folders in a row and squared their edges. Marcus stood near the door, because the building's management had asked him to be present as the staff witness, and because he wanted to be. The room was still. The kind of still that comes before a thing, not after. They came down together, Renata and Roland, and that was the first signal. Renata moved into the room with the ease of someone who believed it already belonged to her. She glanced at Caleb once, a quick, professional assessment, and then looked past him to Walter, as if Caleb were simply another man the lawyers had brought along. Roland followed, in a coat that cost more than the truth he was standing on, already extending a hand toward Walter, already smiling the smile he used like a tool. "Thank you all for coming," Walter said. "Before any discussion, there are several matters that require acknowledgement by all parties." He opened the first folder. He set the documents down one at a time, unhurried. "This is the title and ownership record for the residential floor of this building," Walter said, "including Unit 41A. The floor is held outright by a holding company. There is no mortgage. There is no co-owner." He slid the page across. "Mrs. Asante has never been an owner or a tenant of record. Her residence was a revocable license, granted personally by the company's principal." Okonkwo placed the second document on the table. Walter walked it through, factual, not cold, simply precise, the date the occupancy license had been revoked, the legal status of the current occupant of 41A, and the single line that named the principal of the holding company, Caleb Asante. Roland's smile did the thing it had not done in any of the months he'd spent telling investors otherwise. It stopped working. He looked at the name on the page, and then at the man across the table in resoled boots, and the arithmetic happened on his face in real time. Okonkwo placed a third sheet beside it, without being asked. "There is also a record of transfers," Walter said, "from a household account to a partnership controlled by Mr. Vane's fund. $55,000 between April and August. The transfers were not disclosed and were not authorized as an investment of marital funds." He let the figures sit in the air. "This will be addressed in the dissolution accounting." Renata's expression had not changed. Or rather, she had worked to keep it from changing, and the effort was visible to anyone watching closely enough. Caleb was watching closely enough. Then, Walter set down the last folder. "There is a final matter," he said, "concerning representations made by Mr. Vane to his limited partners regarding a claimed ownership position in this property." He laid out the prospectus, the page where the Halstead position was listed as an asset of Vane's fund, beside the holding company's record showing no such position had ever existed. "The company's principal has issued a formal disclosure to Mr. Vane's investors. We are not, today, making allegations. We are disclosing that this documentation exists, that it has been preserved, and that the relevant parties have been notified. The silence in the room lasted 11 seconds. Caleb counted them. Renata read the second page twice. The one with Caleb's name as principal. He watched her read it twice. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite recognition. It was the specific look of a person realizing a structure they'd built was standing on the wrong foundation and had been the whole time. She had moved her lover into a penthouse to prove she'd traded up. The page in front of her said she had moved him into her husband's building, into the center of the evidence that would unmake him. Roland had already pushed his chair back from the table. He wasn't looking at her anymore. "You'll want a few minutes with counsel," Walter said. Caleb stood. He gathered nothing from the table. He had brought only himself, and that had served its purpose. He buttoned his jacket. He shook Walter's hand and Okonkwo's. He nodded once to Marcus. He walked toward the door. He stopped. He turned back to Renata, and he said it quietly, only for her, not as performance, because it was meant for her. "You didn't move him into a better life," Caleb said. "You moved him into mine, and you never once thought to ask whose name was on it." He walked out without looking back. It did not happen all at once. Roland Vane's fund did not survive the disclosure. Limited partners do not stay where a flagship asset turns out to be a story told over a borrowed couch. His investors withdrew, then asked questions, and the questions found their own way to the people who ask such questions formally. He left the city within the season. Renata kept the cars and the joint account, and the furniture she'd believed was hers, exactly as she'd demanded, and discovered they did not amount to a life. The penthouse she'd loved was never hers to keep, and she understood that now in a way she hadn't been able to imagine. The friends who had answered her calls while she was trading up began letting things go to voicemail. She was not ruined in any loud way. She was simply smaller. She carried the weight of what she had chosen the way a person carries something they cannot set down. Not dramatically, just constantly. Caleb did not move back into 41A. He had the unit cleared, the locks rekeyed. And then he did a thing that surprised even Walter. He turned the penthouse into the building's owner-occupied management residence and gave it to Marcus's family. Rent folded into the man's raise. Because 9 years at a front desk was a kind of loyalty Caleb knew the price of. He kept working. His new tower topped out that spring 44 floors of his own drawings, now holding their own weight. He answered every call the same day. He gave accurate timelines and hit them. 14 months later, on a cool evening in early October, he sat on the 9th floor balcony of Adelaide's apartment with a glass of water, and below him the city moved through its ordinary night. Adelaide's voice came from the kitchen, asking if he wanted the last of the cobbler. His thermos sat on the rail, filled for the morning, dented on one side. Across the way, the lights of the Halsted Tower came up floor by floor, including the 41st, where a family that had earned the view was settling in for the night. He didn't think about the management office, or the prospectus, or the laugh she'd had the day she told him she needed space. He thought about the deck at 6, the steel waiting, the work. He finished his water. He went inside and turned out the light. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.